to this year's Constitution Day celebration at Cameron University. Given the unusual situation, we are having a completely virtual celebration this year. Constitution Day and Citizenship Day has a somewhat long history in the United States. There have been different versions over the years throughout different parts of the 20th century. The current version, or the current dating of what we do, goes back to 2004, when Congress passed an act requiring institutions that receive federal money to do something on Constitution Day to commemorate the signing of the Constitution on September 17th, 1787. And to teach people something about the Constitution every year. So this is our annual event. It is sponsored this year by the School of Graduate and Professional Studies at Cameron University, and specifically the Department of Social Sciences, and by the Lawton chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. So I am Dr. Jeffrey Metzger in the Department of Social Sciences. I'm here to introduce the rest of our speakers. So we'll have some discussion of the historical background and lead up to the 19th Amendment, which we are commemorating this year, the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and women receiving the right to vote at the federal level and sort of uniformly. Some states, as we'll hear, I think, have allowed them or granted the right to vote to them before that. So we will have Dr. Sarah Ethner Janda speaking first of all about the history. Then Dr. David Searcy talking about the kind of some of the contemporary significance of this event for politics and for the Constitution today. And then Professor Stuart Hooper will ask some questions and lead some discussion. So our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Ethner Janda, is a professor of history at Cameron University, where she has taught since 2001. She teaches a range of courses on modern American history and is currently serving as the president of Cameron's chapter of the American Association of University Professors, also known as the AAUP. She is the author of Beloved Women, The Political Lies of LaDonna Harris and Wilma Mankiller, Pride of the Wichitas, A History of Cameron University, and Prairie Power, Student Activism, Counterculture, and Backlash in Oklahoma, 1962 to 1972. She is currently co-editing a collection of 13 biographical essays on women's activism entitled This Land is Her Land, Gendered Activism in Oklahoma, 1870s to 2010s, which will be published by the University of Oklahoma Press in 2021. Dr. David Cearcy is an assistant professor of political science at Cameron University. He received his master's degree in political science from Oklahoma State University and his doctorate in political science from Southern Illinois University. He has published on the organizational divisions within white evangelical denominations, and he is currently working with a co-author on a method of classifying Christian denominations based upon their ecumenical ties. Mr. Stuart Hooper is an instructor of political science at Cameron University and PhD researcher at City University of London. He teaches international relations, foreign policy, and security studies, and is currently researching the international politics of weapons technology with a focus on artificial intelligence and the US-Sino rivalry. So with the introductions done, I will now hand it over to Dr. Ethner Janda, who again will discuss the historical background to the 19th Amendment.
All right, thank you, and welcome to Constitution Day, everyone. So I thought I would start talking just a little bit about the background to the women's suffrage movement to kind of explain why it becomes such a tense issue in the United States in the early 20th century in particular. So going back to the early 19th century, you know, by the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, one of the things that had happened politically in the United States is that a lot of states had decided to extend suffrage to all white men. So regardless of property ownership or money, education, those kinds of things, increasing numbers of white men were being granted the right to vote. And that coincided with a long growing movement of reform, the temperance movement to limit consumption and then ultimately to abolish consumption of alcohol. The anti-slavery movement was in full force by this time. So there are a number of social movements to improve society going on at the same time as increasing numbers of white men across America were getting the right to vote. And that certainly led to frustration on the part of a small group of women who really felt it unjust that they didn't have the right to vote. And what we see by 1848 is a concerted effort by a small group of women to try and gain access to voting rights in the United States. With the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in New York, you have a group of women who came together, joined by a handful of male supporters, about 300 women or so that attended this first meeting. They were also joined by the famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who also supported the right of women to vote and have equal access to the same things that white men and what he wanted for African-American men to have access to as well. So he joins them, and what they do at Seneca Falls is they work on ideas that they think will convince the public why women should have the right to vote. And Seneca Falls draws heavily on natural law arguments. And in fact, they base their arguments on the Declaration of Independence and argue that women should have the same rights that men have. Women need the right to vote for the same reason that men need the right to vote. Women need to have access to education and property rights for the same reason that men have access to them. And so for this early group that met at Seneca Falls, they really thought of women's rights as an extension of natural law, rather, not national law yet. But when they talk about the right of women to vote and the right of women to have equal treatment to men, one of the problems they encounter is that it concerned a lot of people, the notion that women and men be treated the same. We'll see this later on with the Equal Rights Amendment debate, but the right to vote, when arguments were rooted in natural law and the idea that women should have this right as a simple matter of equality, that met with a lot of resistance. A number of organizations will form between 1848 and the early 19-teens that oppose the right of women to vote. And one of the interesting things at this stage that we see is the idea that women as well as men were a part of both movements. So the suffrage movement absolutely included male supporters, but the anti-suffrage movement was paved by women who opposed the right of women to vote because of various fears that they had about the impact on family, that it would turn women into men, that it went against the Bible. There were a whole host of issues that were raised. And so what women in the United States ran into in this effort to secure the right to vote is a profound backlash, the fact that it's not an issue that all women agreed on, and the fact that there were concerted efforts to try and keep this from coming to fruition. There were numerous suffrage organizations that were created following the Seneca Falls meeting, and you see women really trying to find an argument that would work to convince people that they should be given the right to vote. What happens more broadly in the United States as we move later into the late 19th century is that there's this increase in progressive activism and this growing notion that stresses not so much natural law, but the idea that women are more moral than men. We'd already seen elements of this in the temperance movement. And so increasingly, you see the public responding to the idea where maybe they didn't like the notion that women should have the same rights as men, but when you start talking about give women the right to vote because they're more moral than men, and in a period when people were looking carefully at widespread corruption in politics, particularly in cities, you have this interesting idea that emerges that suggests, well, look, women are more moral than men. And so if you give women the right to vote, they can clean up a lot of these problems that exist in society. And so the significance of that is this idea that women voting somehow would represent a shift toward a more moral society. So I always think it's interesting that it's not so much natural law, right? Women should have the same rights that men have, that changes a lot of minds in the United States. It's more this notion that in this one area, not so much in other areas, but in this one area, women are superior to men. They're more moral. They are more likely to be in church attendance. I mean, this goes all the way back to the Puritan fears that women dominated church pews and men tended to stay at home more frequently. So that's an argument that will gain in success. One of the great complications in the suffrage movement, though, emerged at the end of the Civil War with the adoption of the 15th Amendment, which granted, it grants African-American men the right to vote. And the reason I say sort of is because it says a person's right cannot be denied to vote based on race, previous servitude, ethnicity. Well, the problem with that is you could circumvent it and find other reasons to not let African-American men vote. But it introduced an element of heightened racism within the movement and frustration, because in 1870, when the 15th Amendment was adopted, that meant that African-American men who had just been freed from slavery could now vote, and white women who might be upper class, well-educated, still didn't have that right to vote. And so that absolutely introduces a significant tension within the suffrage movement that suffragists never fully overcome. It's one of the complications in using a term like celebration for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment because of some of the racism within the suffrage movement. So that complicates things, and you begin to also see some suffrage groups talking about, look, if you give women the right to vote, and really they meant middle and upper class white women, if you give women the right to vote, they can counter the immigrant vote, or they could counter the Black vote. And so there is sort of that exacerbated element within it. As we move further into the progressive era in the early 20th century, one of the things that happens is the suffrage movement continues to grow. It ultimately splits in part over the issue of whether the focus should be on a state-by-state effort to get individual states to approve the right of women to vote, or whether there should be a national amendment to the Constitution granting women the right to vote. So there's that tension in place. There's also, by the early teens, a growing tension between different generations of suffragists. There are tensions over race, as I mentioned earlier. There are tensions over how forceful women should be in asking for the right to vote. And nothing complicates that more than the onset of World War I, particularly once the United States enters into World War I. And the reason for that is that women's suffrage organizations had been protesting in front of the White House and other areas, demanding the right to vote. And there were certainly many Americans who felt that it was wrong, it was unpatriotic to protest in front of the White House for the right to vote during a time when the United States was engaged in war. And that is going to be one of the, not only one of the more damaging moments within the suffrage movement, it's also problematic because of the amount of violence that surrounded it. So when we think of suffragists, and you picture images of women in their long dresses, neatly marching or holding banners and signs, what you don't perhaps imagine are women being beaten, women being sent to mental institutions, but that's exactly what happened. It wasn't unique to the period during World War I, but that greatly increased. A number of women were arrested, they were sent to workhouses, or they were put in insane asylums. And the basic justification for this is that women wanting to vote symbolized women not wanting to be women, that they had something psychologically wrong with them by trying to usurp the roles of men, and a kind of early penis envy, if you will. And so that notion is going to be very jarring for a lot of Americans as they come to learn about multiple instances where women were force-fed, brutalized. Hunger strikes were a common tactic used by suffragists. And so the response to that by authorities were forced feedings. And these were really horrific instruments that were used to force women to eat. So ultimately what comes out of this is a kind of divisiveness, but it's happening at the same time as during World War I, you have women volunteering their time to support the war. You have wives, mothers, daughters, sisters engaged in various kinds of patriotic acts. You have women moving into the workforce in a temporary, so acceptable capacity to support the war effort. And ultimately this kind of contribution of citizenship is used as a significant justification for finally granting women the right to vote. It's a long, drawn-out process. It is a divisive process, and it is a process that is fraught with a lot of opposition. But despite these levels of opposition, one of the things to keep in mind, and we'll talk more about this as we go, Dr. Searcy will be addressing it as well, the right of women to vote, even though not all women wanted it or supported it, and it had its critics, it was the one issue around which women were really able to come together and support it in large numbers. And so again, it's not universally supported, but there's no other issue in the United States around which women could come together and support it. And I mention this here because it's part of why after women get the right to vote in 1920, you see a splintering of the women's rights movement, because other issues, whether it's pay, it's child labor, it's greater political equality, you didn't have nearly as many women able to find common ground there. Alice Paul, one of the many suffragists that worked to gain women's right to vote, thought that suffrage was really just the first step for women. And so that's why 3 years after women got the right to vote in 1923, she introduced the Equal Rights Amendment for the first time. It would be introduced many times after this, but her idea, and in the basic original language, it just says that women and men, actually says men and women, shall have equal rights. Well, that seems like a pretty basic statement. It's the premise behind a lot of the suffrage efforts, but it failed to gain a lot of traction in many respects. It was viewed as a very divisive issue. And so we'll look at this. Dr. Cearcy will, of course, be talking about what happens with this amendment over time and some of the divides that certainly still inform our political behavior today when it comes to this. So I will go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Searcy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janda. What I'm going to do is kind of pick up the ball from where Dr. Janda left off, kind of touch a little bit on the amendment process itself. So maybe jump back and then jump way forward. So, mine's a little different because I've got some slides I want to share. So, and really kind of one of the basic ideas that I hope that you will hopefully see as I'm talking about is a lot of the issues that Dr. Janda talked about that existed 100 years ago with ratification and 150 years ago in the lead up, in the aftermath of the Civil War, and even before the Civil War, the divisions that existed in the women's rights movement, those are still here today, even 100 years later. So, but first, I wanted to highlight this. One commonly misunderstood thing about voting in the United States is that the power to regulate elections is given to state governments. That means that who gets to vote, in particular in areas where the Constitution is silent, those are powers that are widely given to states. And so this is a map of what was the state of women's suffrage in 1917, which hopefully will illustrate it. And if you look at the United States, you'll notice that all the different states are colored differently. What that reflects is that women's right to vote at this period of time varied depending on what part of the country you live in. The white states were states where women had full suffrage. So you'll notice those are predominantly in the West. Then the states that are colored in completely black, women had no suffrage, so women could not vote. And then the states with either dots or crosses, there was partial suffrage. They could vote in some, but not another. This is still true to this day. States still have a lot of authority in regulating elections. So that covers things like, for instance, voter registration, things like deadlines, when you have to be registered in order to participate in a vote, what you have to bring. So issues like photo IDs, which have become kind of a common talking point, those vary depending on where you happen to live. Even things like, if you're a convicted felon, do you get to vote, and will you ever get to vote? Some states would say, no, you never get to vote again. Other states like Connecticut have polling places literally in prisons, and people vote in the jail. So that's up to the states themselves to decide. And that was what an issue that suffragists themselves were facing. So when Dr. Janda talked about a state-by-state basis, are we going to go state by state, or are we going to try and get a national amendment? Now, why is an amendment important? Well, one is amendments apply to everybody. And one thing that Dr. Janda didn't touch on, but it is the case, is that suffragists, and you can see that in that map I put up, they had big success in parts of the country and very little to no success in the others, particularly the deep south of the states that were in the former Confederacy. Even up until the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women didn't many of them hadn't moved towards ratification. Arkansas, in this case, being the exception. So amendments are a way to apply a right to everyone. Amendments are exceptionally hard to get into the Constitution, though. The Constitution gives 4 different ways that an amendment can be added. Really, though, you can probably get by knowing one, because of the 27 amendments we have, 26 of them that use this one method. And that is that in order for an amendment to be added to the Constitution, you have to get 2/3 of each chamber of Congress. So 2/3 of the House and then 2/3 of the Senate to vote in favor of it. It then goes to state legislatures, and you need 3/4 of those states. So in addition to applying to everyone, amendments are really good because they're really hard to change. We've only had one amendment once it has been ratified that has later been modified. And then kind of like the last part that I didn't even put a bullet point for, but it kind of strikes me that maybe I should mention it, is that amendments are really important because of that hardness to change. It means they're a lot harder to change than a law. You have the prevailing political wind really has to go against you. Once it's enshrined, it's pretty much it moving forward. Amendments are also really rare. Outside of the Bill of Rights, those first 10 amendments, which were all ratified right after within a few years of the ratification of the Constitution, we've only formally amended the Constitution 17 times in 250 years. So these are rare things. But once women get the right to vote, what do they do with it? Well, one thing that we need to that I think is important to point out, and you can see it in this graph I put here, is that since 1964, voting turnout among women has been higher than men, and at least in presidential elections, that has been consistent since 1964. And you can see it steadily kind of going over time. This is data from the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers. Among people that study the effect of gender and voting in American politics, one of the big concepts is not voting turnout, but is actually what we call the gender gap. The gender gap, it basically is looking for and trying to explain, is there a gap between similar men and women on partisanship? So similarly, like you know, men and women who have similar economic and racial groups, do they vote for different candidates? And what we found is that, yes, there is a gender gap. There is a difference. Men and women are voting for different candidates. We've detected this since the 1980s. And it's been fairly consistent in that women are more likely to vote for Democratic candidates than men are. Early research on this basically said that in the 1980s, women became more liberal. That literature has kind of changed and evolved. And now it's generally said that men became more conservative in 1980. That men and women voted for about the same in 1976, and then women stayed about the same, and men broke for Reagan in that election and stayed with the Republican Party moving forward. Other demographic variables we try to add into this don't account or get rid of this gap. So one argument you might hear is, well, maybe this is just young women are more Democratic. So this is data from 2009. I mean, and we could find this consistent over time, but this is just 1 year. And it shows that basically, even if you account for age, even if you compare 18-year-old women to 18-year-old men, if you compare 84-year-old women to 84-year-old men, women are still more Democratic. That's why they're higher on the chart. A lot was discussed about the gender gap in the most recent presidential election, partially because it was the first time that one of the two major parties actually nominated a woman, Hillary Clinton, to run for president of the United States. Parties had nominated women to be run for vice president before, but this is the first major party candidate that is a woman to run for president, to win her party's nomination, I should say. Women were running in have been running in primaries for a while. What 2016 was only unique in the size of the gap. But the gender gap has existed for 40 years, and it's been fairly consistent. So here's what I'm talking about, like the more things change. There are still big racial differences in who women are voting for. So 2016 is a great kind of example of this. So this is data from Edison exit polls that I kind of put through together for you. It looks at women divided by 4 different racial categories. So moving from left to right, we have African American women, Hispanic women, women who are non-white but are also not African American or Hispanic. And then on the final column, we have white women. And this is the percentage of each group that voted for Hillary Clinton. And you'll notice there's a huge difference between white women and non-white women. That there's some fluctuation on non-white women, but even in the Hispanic category, they're still getting 65. Hillary Clinton's still getting 65 to 70% of the vote, and then we get to white women, and that plummets. And that again, fairly consistent. Socioeconomics do play a role in this, just like socioeconomics played a role in early women's suffrage movement. What's kind of interesting is if you look at this chart, the effect of socioeconomics is different for white women and for non-white women. The effect is very small in non-white women, and it actually made them more likely to vote for Trump. Trump got a higher percentage of the vote among non-white women who had some college education compared to non-white women who had no college education. But then if you go to white women, that trend is not only reversed, but the size is a lot bigger. White non-college educated women voted something like 65% for Trump, but Hillary Clinton actually managed to get a majority of the white college educated women vote. So that's just kind of interesting how class interacts with gender in their vote, depending on your racial category. And this has really important implications beyond just which candidate we're voting on. For one, because of this gender gap, one thing we see is if we track it over time, female legislators are becoming overwhelmingly Democratic, where women are winning races, and women are winning more races all the time. So there are more women in our Congress today than there have ever been in any Congress before. And so what this is just a chart that of the number of female legislators since the 2000 election, so the last few Congresses. But what I did was, instead of just putting the number in, I separated them out by political party. And so the blue lines are the Democratic women and the red is the Republican women. And what you can see is that the increase is far and away made up of Democratic women, right? That they're the ones who are winning these races. And in fact, there are only in the House of Representatives 13 women Republicans, which is the lowest number in 30, 40 years. This has important implications for things like the implicit bias that voters have when they're making decisions. So there's an entire field of research called political psychology that studies what is it that people are thinking when they're reading things. And so in that, we can find that if I give you the exact same information about a candidate or the exact same candidate issue positions, but I name one candidate Bob Johnson and I name another candidate Sally Johnson, people will assume that Sally Johnson is more liberal than Bob, even if I give them the exact same information about both. That means that depending on the context, women who are interested in running for Congress might find it harder to win a race. Particularly women running in Republican primaries have to overcome this challenge that voters, just on the basis of their gender, are going to assume they are more liberal than they actually are. And so they have to kind of go out of their way to win, particularly in the era of if you live in a gerrymandered district, you really have to spend a lot of time and throw a lot of red meat out even to have a chance, because people are going to assume that you're too liberal for them just based on your gender. So the Equal Rights Amendment was, at least the modern Equal Rights Amendment, came before Congress in the 1970s. It very quickly passed through Congress. It got 2/3 of the vote of the House and 2/3 of the vote of the Senate fairly quickly. And then it went to the states. And most political commentators, at least early in the process, believed that it was going to be a quick ratification. That turned out to not be the case. Basically, there was a large group, a large amount of backlash to it. The famous Phyllis Schlafly argued against it. There's a pretty good documentary series on Hulu about this. If you want to know anything about this, it has Cate Blanchett in it. I would recommend it. So basically, Congress passes this in the 1970s, and when they send it to the states, they include a deadline for the states to ratify it by. They then, when it looks like it gets in trouble, they pass it again in Congress and give a second deadline of 1982. That deadline was not met. The ERA fell 3 states short of ratification, and for the most part, the Equal Rights Amendment was considered dead. I know when I first started teaching in graduate school, I would teach about the ERA as this kind of dead, almost happened. Here's an example of an amendment that got a little far, but then it fell apart and, it just didn't come together. What's kind of interesting, what's most interesting about it is that the Equal Rights Amendment in the last few years has actually come back. In 2017, Nevada ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And then following that in 2018, Illinois followed suit. And then in 2020, Virginia becomes the 38th state. So the ERA is now actually passed that 3/4 majority requirement of the states. And in fact, in Virginia, it was a campaign issue. People ran for the state legislature of Virginia on the platform, vote for us, we will ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So if it's past the 3/4, is the ERA in the Constitution? It is not. Why? Well, the ERA faces a few pressing challenges. One is, the big one right off the bat, is that expiration date. When Congress passed it, they set this date of 1982. Now, could Congress conceivably change that date? Yeah, actually they could. But there are lawyers on kind of both sides who will give arguments about it. Related to that, there's the interesting question of that the ERA might be the only amendment that I know of that faces this, which is de-ratification. So if you look at this map, you'll notice there are 5 states that are colored in orange. Those are all states that ratified the ERA back in the 70s. And then when it becomes controversial and it starts running into trouble, went back and voted to de-ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. There is a very interesting constitutional argument on whether or not a state can actually de-ratify an amendment, particularly between the time it gets to the states and the time it gets the required number of states and is added to the Constitution. If Congress did change the deadline, and it might, depending on how the most recent elections come up. Kamala Harris, who's currently running for vice president, when she was running for president, one of her campaign issues was, we need to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's one final obstacle. And if you are a person who studies gender issues, it's an obstacle that you may not have appreciated, you may not have expected. And that is, because of this de-ratification, because of this deadline, if Congress did change it, there would be a lawsuit. And in any major lawsuit, it would probably end up in a federal court and maybe the U.S. Supreme Court. And if it got to the U.S. Supreme Court, it would meet not any of the conservatives, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So here's a quote. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was asked about the Equal Rights Amendment in February, and this is what she said. There's just too much controversy about latecomers. Plus a number of states have withdrawn their ratification. So if you count a latecomer on the plus side, how can you disregard states that said, we've changed our minds? If you're counting up Supreme Court votes and you're like, here's the ones we need to win this case, you need to count, if you're on the pro-ERA side, you need to count on RBG's vote. And that's bad. Now, I'm sure that Dr. Janda and I might talk about this later, so I'm going to kind of leave my thoughts and predictions about what might happen. But this is a pressing issue. If Congress didn't start over, if it tried to move forward with the version of the ERA that was originally ratified and voted on in the 1970s, you're going to have a lawsuit. And it's not a great sign if the Supreme Court, particularly one of the more liberal members on the Supreme Court, is already kind of giving a signal to you that, hey, I don't think this is a great idea. So I'm going to stop sharing mine, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Professor Hooper, for his questions.
Great. Well, let me just start off by thanking both of you for your contributions. They were both very informative and leave us with some interesting questions to consider. So the first one, I think we'll let Professor Cearcy jump straight back into this, and then Dr. Janda, if you can give us your opinion. Is the ERA eventually going to be ratified?
No. Well, okay, so that's a glib answer. Here's the problem. The ERA has 2 main problems, as I see it. One is, well, I find it hard to believe that if push came to shove, that Justice Ginsburg would be the one casting the deciding vote that killed the ERA. I do not believe she would do that. On the other hand, what she might be doing is, the Supreme Court, that it is kind of a body where they know each other, they do work together. She might be sending a signal as to what the temperature in that room is, and that, hey, if we go forward with this, we're going to lose. The other problem I could kind of theoretically see with the ERA, if you went with the starting over, and is that the ERA always, and Dr. Janda alluded to this in her presentation, it always kind of gets bound up in these other issues. If you ask people, if I do a poll, for instance, and I ask people, should women be treated the same as men? They generally will say yes. Even if they don't believe it, they think it's, hey, that's something I'm supposed to say. But then, like in the suffrage debate, well, maybe women should be able to vote, but if we vote, they're going to vote in favor of temperance, and then I'm not going to be able to drink alcohol, so maybe I shouldn't do that. The ERA today, one issue that it's didn't face in the 70s that it would face today is abortion. Abortion was, even though Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973, it didn't become a motivating political issue until 1980, by which point the ERA was kind of on its last legs. And you can kind of see this in areas where people have mobilized against the ERA, is they have said, well, yeah, you think of this as we're going to pay women the same in employment, but actually what it means is that we're going to start government funding of abortion. And that's something that is going to be a harder social issue to account for if you're in the pro-ERA side. So I think it's possible, but I think you should always bet on amendments won't get added to the Constitution because it's so hard for amendments to get added to the Constitution.
Well, let's stick with that it is possible. If it was possible and it was ratified, Dr. Janda, what impact do you reckon it would actually have on the economic, political, or social status of women in the US?
Well, so I think if it actually was ratified, it would have a lot, it would generate a lot of court cases. And so I think what Dr. Cearcy was talking about is really important, because for it to be enacted, you got to remember that there are all of these laws that have been passed and predicated on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, right? So there are some people who oppose ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment today because they argue it's redundant, that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment gives women the constitutional foundation they need for all legislation that would support equality for them. The thing about the word discriminate is we tend to use it in a negative context, but when you think about it instead from the standpoint of not being able to distinguish between women and men, certainly when you look at debates over compulsory military service in the draft, right? Could you require men to be drafted and women not? Probably not with the Equal Rights Amendment. That was certainly an issue for some in the 1970s and 1980s. Politically, when you look at women's voting patterns, I don't think it would have a major, as big of an impact there as it would economically and socially. I think that women exercising rights in the United States today often see the Equal Rights Amendment as something that is either absolutely necessary for them to find that they can be paid the same as men, or they find it to be redundant legislation. And it tends to have a lot to do with their larger political leanings. There are a lot of complications to the Equal Rights Amendment that people didn't necessarily think through at the time. One of the big issues, and you can flip the abortion debate on its head a little bit, I think, when you talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. There are opponents who argue that if the Equal Rights Amendment were ratified, then abortion would gain increased funding support and so forth. But there's another argument to be made, which is that if the Equal Rights Amendment became law, then maybe men have greater say in whether or not women can have abortions. Maybe men's rights get privileged there. And so I think one of the big takeaways from the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment is it's really complicated. And the one certainty I think we can have about the Equal Rights Amendment, if that amendment is ever fully ratified and adopted to the Constitution, there will be an immense body of case law that comes out of that, because it's just staggering to look at how many laws at the state level, but also at a federal level, have been passed predicated on the Equal Protection Clause. And so this would really complicate things, I think, in interesting ways.
So they would start.
And if I can I'm sorry, Professor, if I could jump in. Also, the one thing is the text of the Equal Rights Amendment, as it is written now, it doesn't guarantee equality. What it does is it says that that you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, or that equality of rights under the law should not be denied or abridged on account of sex. One problem with the 15th Amendment that Dr. Janda alluded to is that the 15th Amendment has similar language, and so states found other ways to disproportionately affect, take away African American males' right to vote that were not explicitly race, but they effectively did the same thing. And so if you're talking about equality in terms of pay or promotion in like the economic sense, well, then maybe you're saying an employer could find, employers are very crafty at finding ways of treating people unequally. Oh, well, that person, we do have lots of research, for instance, about why women, especially early when women started getting elected in the 70s and the 80s in larger numbers and then to the 90s, why were female legislators having a harder time getting laws passed? And it was things like, well, legislators would get together and they'd play golf together. And that was how they bonded and how they built these kind of coalitions where they could reach across the aisles. But women weren't invited to that. And so it's not that they were necessarily excluded. They just thought, well, this female legislator doesn't want to go out with us. And so we just didn't build these bonds of friendship. And you could theoretically still see that. It's not, even if it were ratified, while it would be a step forward, it would be a massive, important signal that this is something that we expect. It wouldn't be sunshine and rainbows and everything would be fixed either, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it sounds like it would generate quite a intense debate across the country if this was to become another huge issue. What are some of the most surprising patterns that have emerged in women's voting over the past 100 years? Would either of you like to comment on that?
So I think initially the most surprising occurrence in women's voting patterns is that they didn't all vote the same. And this was really interesting in the 1920s because, again, it goes back to this idea that women are more moral than men. And so they're going to vote as wives and mothers. So that means they're all going to vote the same way. And a lot of members of Congress thought that, and they're worried. They're like, well, wait a minute, if women all vote the same, that's a really powerful voting bloc. And so I think early on in the 1920s, the biggest shock was that women did not all vote the same. Now, the other prediction was that women would all vote the same way as their husbands voted. That too has been inaccurate. And you see that in the slide that Dr. Cearcy showed, where you can see the gender gap between women and men in elections. So I think that those are two of the biggest surprises that have happened in terms of women's voting patterns.
Speaking of husbands and wives, there was a very funny political science paper that was written, I guess it was about 30 years ago, where they would ask women their party identification in front of their husbands, and then, or they would later, and then they would check what they actually were registered as. And what they found is women were more likely, if they were in front, like being interviewed with their husband in the room, to say they were the same as their husband, even if they were registered as and voting for candidates, presumably voting for candidates who were in the opposite side. That they were just like, what? Yeah, they avoided conversations with it. Although that probably has gone down a little bit over the past year. I guess maybe one of my more interesting takeaways, and it's kind of probably an example of where things like Twitter are not real life, is that there isn't more kind of an intersectional crossover, even 150, 160 years later. One would think, if you're talking about equality, and people like Frederick Douglass talked about this, that we're all kind of working together in this system, and that they disagreed on the order in which things needed to get done, but that African American men will get the right to vote, and then we'll use that to give women the right to vote, and we can all work together, and we're all kind of involved in the same struggle because we're not being treated equally. And you just don't find that. Particularly among, and not everyone, but particularly among, there's a large section of white women who, for instance, do not see people of color as facing the same challenges as they do. There was a real interesting poll a few months ago where they asked people, it was in the aftermath of George Floyd, where they were asking people about discrimination. And something like 2/3 of women said, oh yes, women are treated less equally than men in the workforce. But they found something like only 45% of women said that people of color were not being treated equally to white people in the workforce. And so you just don't, you always kind of, there's this idea that, well, this intersectional argument that we're all in the same struggle and we're all going to work together, and it just never happened.
Well, that's a great way to shift into our third question here. Dr. Janda, could you maybe talk about the role of race and racism in the suffrage movement?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, race is a central issue, and it's there because there are plenty of white women who believe that they should have the right to vote, but that doesn't mean that they saw themselves as equal to African Americans. And that's part of why when the 15th Amendment was going through the ratification process, women's suffrage is split over whether they should actively oppose the 15th Amendment because it didn't include women. And so that tension carries all throughout, not just the actual ratification process of the 19th Amendment, but it's still a factor today. And so one of the things that you see is the issue of segregation within the women's rights movement. So in 1913, there was a massive parade that was organized by suffragists to parade in favor of women's right to vote. And Ida B. Wells, who's this really famous African-American educator, she dedicates her life to trying to get federal anti-lynching laws passed, and is very well known in her lifetime. And she's asked to not attend and not march because it would be embarrassing to the suffragists if she's not, if she's sort of off into the back and clearly segregated. That's kind of awkward, but it's even more awkward if she's not segregated. And so they ask her to just not participate. And the leaving out of women of color in general has been one of the big blights on the women's suffrage movement. Indigenous women were often excluded, and depending on the tribe, because there's a lot of variation, but in some tribes, particularly matrilineal tribes, women already exercised political influence or played a role in voting in certain ways. And so they are in a very different kind of situation and don't entirely understand some of the divisions that are taking place in the broader women's rights movement. But race continues to pose a challenge to suffragists. A lot of hostility toward people of color among many white suffragists. And so the tension that you see there is going to emerge again when we look at the women's rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. It's there within the Equal Rights Amendment debates that are going on in the 1970s and 1980s. And the single biggest challenge by the time we get into the 1960s is that many white women tended to view sexism as the biggest obstacle that women faced, which is a very smug way of undercutting some of the racial challenges that the country was dealing with at the time. And it was made it difficult for Hispanic women, African-American women, Indigenous women, and other groups to really relate to mainstream efforts to secure rights, whether it's the Equal Rights Amendment or voting rights for women.
Yeah, and Dr. Cearcy, you already kind of alluded to this, but could you maybe expand upon that impact of race and racism today on voting trends among women?
Well, just to add, I've said a lot, and then I agree with everything Dr. Janda just said. But one thing, if you look at, say, the slide I put up about women voting in the last election, and this kind of highlights this point, is if you are, say, the Democratic Party, and I think this has been very much reflected in candidate Biden's vice presidential search. Women as a group, while there is this gender gap, and women in general are more likely to vote for a Democrat than a Republican, if you want to talk about who is the most reliable voting bloc for the Democratic Party, it is African American women and is non-white women. And I think that kind of reflects, I think that he even alluded to it when he was going through the VP search, was that he not only, Joe Biden, even before he took a commanding lead in that race, said, if I win, I'm going to nominate a woman to be my vice president. And then as it got further, it was, I want to look for a woman of color. And many commentators argued this is something that we women of color deserve, because we are the foundational voting bloc of this party. There is no other group that is voting at 90 to 95% in favor of one party. And this is across the country. In a few years ago in Alabama, when Roy Moore was running for the Senate and he lost, there were some commentaries that said, well, okay, he lost because he lost women's support. He didn't. He actually won a majority of white women's support. What he lost was he lost 98% of the black female vote, which can be sizable in Alabama when it turns out. And so there is, in just partisanship, there is still big racial differences in candidate preference among women, which makes sense because women are people. Women are people just like men, and they're divided on things. And if women did, Dr. Janda alluded to this in her talk about the 1920. If women did overwhelmingly vote 95% together, they would win everything. There are more women voters in the United States, and they turn out at a higher rate than men. Only the fact that the women in vote is split is the only thing stopping them from getting everything they want. If you're a woman watching this, you should vote together. You would win all the time. We would not stop you.
Well, that's an interesting point to jump into my next question for Dr. Janda here. So people were obviously very afraid about giving women the right to vote, but did those fears actually prove to be accurate at all?
So no. The fear that women would all vote in a block, despite Dr. Cearcy's call for women to do that, has not happened. And it seems unlikely that it will happen because, as he said, women are people. And so issues of race, class, education, region of the country, religion, all of these kinds of things factor into determining how women are going to vote. And so certainly that fear did not happen. Another fear was that it would split families, that it would emasculate men, that men would lose. There are these great anti-suffragist cartoons that depict men as kind of shriveling in the face of their wives, and they're holding, screaming children, and they don't know what to do with them because how could men know how to take care of their children, and their happy wife is wearing a tie and off to go and vote. That obviously doesn't happen. Social change is much more gradual than that. And so certainly none of those fears really come to fruition. It's ironic that some of the biggest gains made for women in the 20th century happened not because of women voting together, but because of a perception that they would. And you see that first in the 1920s with like the Shepard-Towner Act and some of the healthcare support that we see put into place, because there's a sense we got to do something to make the women happy. They're all going to vote together and we'll all be out of a job if we don't please the women. That perception shaped the 1920s. And I'll also say the Equal Rights Amendment, when it quickly gained support and was moving through very quickly, it's not until women like Phyllis Schlafly began to say, well, wait a minute, we think there's some problems with this. You have Republican men that had accepted the Equal Rights Amendment as a foregone conclusion. And so you get things like the like West Point moving to integrate women into the service academy because they think it's going to happen quickly anyway, and it's going to take us some time to adopt to this. And they wouldn't have done it when they did. Women would not have been admitted to West Point when they were in the mid 1970s if West Point hadn't understood that this was about to come down anyway, and they better just go ahead and get started. And so there are, I think those are some of the interesting things that came out of it. But in terms of the actual fears, I would say that no, those were did not turn out to be very legitimate.
Yeah, definitely sounds accurate. Dr. Cearcy, maybe you could just wrap us up here on Constitution Day. You spoke a little on why it's so difficult to amend the Constitution. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
It depends on if you agree with what the prevailing government is doing. So is it a bad? No, I mean, we do have what is generally referred to as like informal ways that we amend the Constitution through judicial interpretation and things like that. So there is, you know, we didn't amend the Constitution, for instance, to say that equal protection meant that gays and lesbians had a right to get married, because we didn't need to do that. We had a court decision that kind of informally said, okay, this is what that means. Now, is it a good or a bad thing? It depends on, again, it depends on if you like what is going on. In the instance of LGBT rights, you're probably it's probably a good thing that constitutional amendments are so hard, because in 2004, 2003, 2004, when states were amending their own constitutions, the fact that even during that period when that was being pushed, it never really becomes something that's seriously going to happen on the national stage. Even if when it was discussed, it wasn't something that was seriously like this is actually going to happen. It never got out of Congress, for instance, because that bar was so high. So the one thing I will say is, and this is kind of an interesting point to wrap up with our discussion of the 19th Amendment, after the Bill of Rights is ratified, we only have formally amended the Constitution 17 times. Of those 17 times, more than a third have expanded the right of people to vote. And that's an important area where you do see movements on constitutional amendments. So they were either things like the 19th Amendment or the 15th Amendment that gave the right to vote to an ethnic or a gender category that didn't have it before. Or they were things like the direct election of senators, so giving you access to vote for in races you didn't have a right to vote in before then. Granting electoral college votes to Washington, D.C., things like that. Barring things like poll tax, which is barring people from accessing ballots. So when in terms of big issues like voting, there has been movements on amendments. So, and people do move in favor of it. So I don't necessarily think it's a good or a bad thing, but then again, I tend to not want to say anything is a good or a bad thing when talking about politics. It is what it is, I guess, to paraphrase.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective to have when we look at politics. You're right. We want to give as critical of a view as possible and balance up the good and the bad on both sides. I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Metzger, Dr. Janda, and Dr. Cearcy for participating in our Constitution Day event here today at Cameron University, and thank all of you for watching.